At the start of today's game in the World Chess Championship, Magnus Carlsen was leading by a point. But there are, of course, still 4 games to be played, including this one. Plenty of time for Anand to make a comeback. So the question was, what would Carlsen do with white? Would he go for a win, all out for a win? Would he risk something? Or would he play more safely? He started with e4, and the players went into this well-known Berlin variation. And instead of protecting the pawn on e4, Carlsen just castled, so they went into this famous Berlin Wall endgame. Now, this endgame was popularized, well, by several players actually, but at the highest level, most notably by Vladimir Kramnik. He played this against Kasparov in their World Championship match in the year 2000, and Kasparov really didn't make any progress, and it was because of that, really, that Kramnik was able to wrest the crown from Kasparov. Now, this was played by the players in this match in Game 7. Now, if you recall, Carlsen succeeded in getting a position that he liked very much and managed to torture Anand for many moves. This is exactly the same as in Game 7, and there Carlsen played bishop f4. But no doubt, fearing some kind of improvement from Anand, I'm sure he had one ready, Carlsen played a different variation, knight e2. Now this is a fairly regular way to play the position, so the knight looks to come to f4 to possibly support the advance of the e-pawn, to try to use this kingside pawn majority. You can see here that white has 4 pawns against black's 3. This is the whole one of the strategic points of this opening, that white somehow has this, well, a theoretical structural advantage, but it's very hard to actually make anything of it because black has no real weaknesses in his position, and he has the 2 bishops, and he's very solid. Anand played b6. Now that's in order to bring this bishop out to either b7 or a6, and certainly not a bad idea to try to place the bishop on this long diagonal. Rook d1 from Carlsen, so that's preempting bishop a6. And bishop b7 is really the move that we would like to play, putting the bishop on this long diagonal. But then, well, maybe Anand didn't do this because he didn't want to allow knight d4. Normally you'd like to drive the knight away with c5, but then in this case the knight comes into b5, hitting the pawn on c7, and that's rather annoying. So first, very subtle idea from Anand. He played bishop a6, hitting the knight. Now if the knight comes to d4, then in this case c5 is possible, because knight b5, of course, is no longer possible. It's been taken by the bishop. And then the bishop will return to the long diagonal. So Carlsen, after bishop a6, played knight f4. It's the usual square for this knight. And only then Anand ducks back with the bishop onto this excellent long diagonal. So black's threat is to play the pawn up to c5, and then that bishop really cuts very nicely across the board. And already Carlsen clearly felt uncomfortable with his position. He thought for just over 15 minutes here and came up with the move e6. So already advancing this pawn, but I think he realised that after bishop d6, black has a wonderful bishop pair, the bishop on d6 solidly protected by the pawn here, and the bishop on b7 ready to fire across the board once that c-pawn advances. And those bishops look really good. And here, for example, well, Carlsen could support that pawn on e6 with rook e1. But then f6 is potentially quite a dangerous move. Now, that pawn on e6 is actually a little bit stranded. It's very hard for white to support that. And if moves like knight g6, well, the rook just comes to g8, And let's say bishop f4. Take this, and now c5. This is the crunch move. And black is ready perhaps to advance the g-pawn, maybe take here. And there's a trick here, by the way. If knight takes pawn, then you can take off this knight on f3 and play the knight into d4, hitting both pawns here. So black is all right in that variation. So basically after f6, I mean, this game could easily turn in black's favour. It's very hard for white to support that advanced pawn. So after another 10 minutes thought, Carlsen actually took on f7 and played the knight into g5, checking the king. The king advanced. Knight came to e4, checking the king went back, and they repeated the position. In fact, they repeated the position 3 times, and here they agreed to a draw. So a very short game, and I'm sure it wasn't exactly what Carlsen wanted. It's certainly, you know, he wanted to put pressure on Anand to use the white pieces. But after the game he said, I didn't quite see what to do here. As long as I don't see anything clear in the position and he's better prepared, then as far as the match is concerned, a draw is okay. So a bit of a compromise, and I think actually probably quite sensible by Carlsen given the position on the board. But psychologically, you know, Anand will feel pleased. So Carlsen is one step closer to securing his crown, but in the remaining 3 games, Anand has the white pieces twice, and those last 3 games are going to be really nerve-wracking for Carlsen, actually. So they play again tomorrow. Do join me for my report after the game. Thanks.